P.T. Logan's 5 Minutes of Terror. Twisted, troubling tales to send a chill up your spine.
Bubblegum. Look! Look! It was hard to understand Barry because of the bubble in front of his face. Look! James was amazed. The bubble that Barry had blown was easily the size of his head. Look! Not wanting to be outdone by his friend, James blew the biggest bubble he possibly could. Once it got to the size of a tangerine, however, it popped loudly, and the sticky pink gum was all over his lips and chin. Shaking his head in disappointment, James looked at Barry again. Unbelievably, the bubble was still growing. Now, when Barry tried to speak, his words had become an unintelligible mumble. He was throwing his hands up wildly, trying to indicate the massive bubble, now twice the size of his head and still growing, without touching it. The boy's face was even turning red. He was blowing so hard. This was, without a doubt, the largest bubble that James had ever seen. James once more tried to blow a bubble of his own, but it was the size of a pathetic little marble before it popped. Upset that his friend was always blowing the biggest bubbles, James reached out and pinched it. Barry couldn't see him, of course. His world was covered in a pink film. The pop was loud, and a split second later, Barry's entire face was covered in bubblegum. It was even in his hair. But Barry wasn't upset. After he struggled to pull it off his face, he continued to smile. Did you see that? That was amazing. James nodded, but he wasn't smiling along with his friend. He was coming up with a plan to finally beat Barry and blow a bubble even bigger than the one covering his friend's face. It was a special mixture of things that James couldn't even begin to pronounce. They were all non-toxic and supposed to help increase the bubble's tensile strength, whatever that was. All James cared about was the fact that it was exactly what he needed to make sure he finally blew a bigger bubble than Barry. James mixed the special substance in with a piece of his gum and then put it back in the package. When Barry came over that afternoon and they stood alone in his backyard, James made sure that he got the special piece of gum, while Barry just got an ordinary one. That bubble yesterday, man, that was something, wasn't it, James? Yeah, something all right. James and Barry started to chew their gum. Do you think that it was a world record? Barry asked. Probably pretty close, right? I don't know about that, James shot back. Well, if it wasn't, then today is going to be for sure a record. You watch. James waited while Barry blew a few practice bubbles. Then he started to blow one of his own. At first, his special gum didn't feel or taste any different. In fact, it felt so ordinary that James started to fear that he'd made a mistake, that Barry had gotten the special piece instead of him. But then he started to blow a bubble and things changed. He could feel the difference now, the increase in tensile strength. Barry didn't notice when James's bubble was the size of a grape, nor did he notice when it was the size of a melon. But when it was as big as his head, Barry suddenly stopped making bubbles of his own. Wow, James, keep going, he urged. Don't stop. And James didn't stop. He was out of breath, but the bubble kept on growing. It was much bigger than his head now, and staring through it made the world all rosy and pink. Face red, lungs burning, James continued to suck in air through his nose and then blow hard with his mouth. James, this is incredible. James couldn't stop, even if he wanted to. It was as if the bubble was controlling him and not the other way around. He kept blowing and the bubble kept growing. It was nearly the size of his entire body now. James? Barry didn't sound excited anymore. He sounded a little scared. Maybe we should just pop it. James kept on blowing air, and before long, the bubble was larger than he was. And yet, he still couldn't stop. His mind was racing, wondering if it would ever pop, if this was all a mistake, when it finally happened. There was a tremendous hiss of air, and then a snapping sound as the bubble finally burst. James expected to be covered in a sticky mess, but that didn't happen. Instead, the bubble somehow folded back on itself. What's going on? He heard Barry shout. James, what's happening? James pushed his hands against the bubble that had since formed around his entire body. It yielded, but didn't break. That's when he felt his feet coming off the ground. He was inside the bubble. James had no idea how it had popped and then reformed around him, but it had. And now he was being lifted off the ground. "Pop it!" he screamed to his friend. "Perry, pop it!" But he was already floating high above his friend, too high for him to reach. James started to panic as he saw his friend shrink. In seconds, he was above his house and then into the clouds. Even if James could pop the bubble now, he wouldn't dare. He would certainly fall to his death. So he floated, hoping that no planes came by, and wondered where the wind would take him and his bubble.
P.T. Logan's 5 Minutes of Terror. Twisted, troubling tales to send a chill up your spine.